In the last 3,400 years of recorded human history, I want you to pick a guess.
Yeah.
How many years do you think the entire planet was actually at peace?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, no major conflicts, no regional wars, no organized slaughter somewhere on the globe, just absolute global quiet.
It's a number that really completely upends how we view ourselves as a species, right?
268 years.
It's just crazy.
That is the exact number. Out of 3.5 millennia, we have managed the collective 268 years of peace.
Right.
And we have this, profound tendency to frame our timeline around eras of stability,
Right.
like the Pax Romana or the post-war boom, the long peace.
We act like stability is the default.
Exactly. We act like it's the standard setting of human civilization, and that conflict is just like a glitch in the system.
Mm-hmm.
But when you actually look at that raw data, peace isn't the rule. Peace is the glitch.
Yeah.
For over 92% of our recorded existence, somebody, somewhere, has been busy killing somebody else in a highly organized fashion. War is the human default.
And, that reality it's baked into the very foundation of human culture itself.
Definitely.
I mean, if you look at the earliest human writings we have, the Sumerian clay tablets from Mesopotamia, which date back to around 3000 BCE, what are they actually writing about?
Right. We always assume it's like high-minded stuff.
Exactly. We like to think the invention of writing was this noble pursuit to record poetry or philosophy or spiritual texts, but a massive portion of those first documented thoughts were essentially just ledgers of violence.
Ledgers of violence. That's a chilling way to put it.
But it's true. The moment we developed the cognitive tool to record our history, we used it to write down exactly how many of our neighbors we managed to conquer and what we took from them.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today for you. We are taking you on a massive 5,000-year journey through the evolution of warfare in this deep dive.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We're going from those sun-baked clay tablets in Mesopotamia all the way to modern drone operators navigating autonomous weapon systems. Because if war is our default setting, we really need to understand how the reasons we fight and the terrifyingly ingenious ways we fight have transformed over time.
Right. And maybe more importantly, what hasn't changed at all.
Exactly. So let's start in the ancient world, say 3000 BCE up to the fall of Rome. If we strip away the mythology and the epic poems, what were those very first recorded wars actually about?
Well, it was almost entirely about resource acquisition. I mean, the very first documented war in human history occurred around 2450 BCE between two Sumerian city-states, Lagash and Umma.
Okay.
And they weren't fighting over a grand ideology or some philosophical clash of civilizations. They were fighting over water.
Just water.
Specifically, the irrigation canals that watered their crops in the Tigris and Euphrates basin. Because in an agrarian society, water isn't just a commodity, it is the absolute dictating force of life and death.
Right. If the canals silt up or your neighbor diverts the flow, your entire city starves.
Exactly. Ancient wars were overwhelmingly direct, brutal economic enterprises.
You fought to take what your neighbor had or to prevent them from taking yours. And the resources weren't just water or grain, right? Human beings were a massive part of that economic equation.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, look at the Roman Empire. Roughly 35% of the entire Roman economy was dependent on slave labor.
Precisely. We often picture the Roman legions as this, noble border patrol securing the frontier for civilization, but functionally they were a massive state-sponsored acquisition team.
Right.
When a Roman legion marched into Gaul or Carthage, they were capturing tens of thousands of people to work in the silver mines, to harvest the massive agricultural estates known as latifundia, and to serve in the cities.
So war was essentially a terrifying mechanism for forced immigration.
It really was. The Roman economic machine was a furnace that required constant fuel, and that fuel was conquered human capital. If Rome stopped conquering, the influx of free labor stopped, and the economy would invariably collapse.
So the baseline is raw economics. But you can't rally tens of thousands of men to march across a desert just by showing them an economic ledger.
No, you need a story.
You need a narrative. And that is where the staggering narcissism of ancient rulers comes into play.
Yeah.
The ego factor. I mean, we are talking about Egyptian pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings who literally viewed themselves as living gods.
And that theology fundamentally changes the stakes of a battle.
How so?
Well, if you are a mortal king and you lose a battle, you lost a battle. You negotiate a treaty, maybe pay a fine and go home. But if you are a living god, the physical embodiment of cosmic order. A defeat on the battlefield is a theological crisis for your entire civilization.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah, because it implies that the cosmic order is breaking down, or that the other side's gods are stronger, or worse, that you aren't actually divine at all.
So it's cosmic validation through violence.
Exactly. Winning meant the gods were pleased. And you see this translated directly into ancient art. I mean, walk through any ruin in Egypt or the Near East and look at the temple walls.
The pharaoh is never drawn to scale, right?
Never. The king is always depicted as a towering, serene giant, while the enemies are painted as these tiny, chaotic dwarfs being trampled underfoot or held up by their hair. War was the ultimate necessary performance of divine supremacy.
Okay, so the objectives are set. Water, human labor, and cosmic ego. But how did the actual mechanics of killing evolve? Let's get into the tactical shifts, starting with the Greeks. Because the Greek phalanx is arguably the first true superweapon in history.
It really was a marvel of military engineering.
Let's break down the geometry and the physics of how a phalanx actually worked.
So, to understand the phalanx, you have to picture a tightly packed rectangular block of soldiers, usually about 8 ranks deep. And the foundation of this formation wasn't actually the spear, it was the shield, the aspis.
Right, the shield.
It was a massive convex wooden shield covered in bronze, roughly a yard across. And the genius of the aspis was its grip. You slid your left arm through a central band and gripped a handle at the rim.
No.
Because of its size, your shield covered your own left side, but it also extended over the right side of the man standing to your left.
So you are completely dependent on the guy next to you for your own survival. It creates this interlocking wall of wood and bronze.
A literal wall. And protruding from this interlocking wall are the dori, spears, roughly 8 to 10 feet long. If you are an enemy charging at a Greek phalanx, there is simply no open space to attack.
You're just running face first into a spiked bronze wall.
Exactly. And the men in the back ranks are physically pushing the men in the front ranks forward. It's this terrifying, crushing maneuver the Greeks called the othismos.
And then Alexander the Great and his father Philip look at this bronze wall and decide, it isn't quite lethal enough.
Right, they had to upgrade it.
They introduced the Macedonian phalanx, which utilizes the sarissa. And this completely blows my mind. The sarissa is an 18-foot-long spear. 18 feet.
Yeah, it requires an entirely different physical mechanic to wield. You need 2 hands just to hold the thing, which means you can't carry that massive aspis shield anymore. You have to strap a smaller shield to your shoulder.
Right. But the trade-off in reach is just insane. Because the spears are 18 feet long, the weapons of the first 5 rows of soldiers extend past the front line of the formation.
It's wild to picture.
If you were facing a Macedonian phalanx, you have to push through 5 separate layers of iron spear points before you can even get close enough to swing a sword at a human being. It's essentially a human porcupine.
It was brilliantly terrifying engineering, and it allowed Alexander to basically sweep across the known world. Frontally, the Macedonian phalanx was almost completely invincible. But, and this is key, it had a fatal structural flaw.
It's like a rigid brick wall. If you hit a brick wall from the front, you just break your hand. But if you can get around to the side of that wall, or if the ground is uneven and a gap opens up between the bricks...
The whole structure loses its integrity and just falls apart.
Exactly. The phalanx couldn't turn quickly. It couldn't fight in forests or on rough hills. And that brings us to the tactical revolution of the Romans. The Romans fought the phalanx, realized its limitations, and completely reinvented the architecture of an army.
The Roman innovation was flexibility. They introduced the legion. Instead of one massive, rigid block of thousands of men moving as a single, cumbersome unit, the Romans broke their army down into smaller, modular units.
The mandals, right.
Right, maniples and later centuries, usually consisting of about 80 men.
So if the Greek phalanx was a rigid brick wall, the Roman legion was a flexible chainmail shirt.
That is the perfect analogy, because those Roman centuries could maneuver entirely independently. The centurion on the ground could make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from the top.
They could adapt in real time.
Exactly. If the terrain was rocky, the units could space out. If the enemy flanked them, the rear units could pivot instantly to face the threat. If the front line got exhausted, they had a highly drilled system where the tired men would filter to the back and fresh men would step forward to take their place.
That dynamic modular system allowed Rome to systematically dismantle the Greek phalanxes and conquer the entire Mediterranean. But I want to shift our focus eastward for a moment to ancient India.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Because while the Greeks and Romans were perfecting infantry geometry, The scale of military operations under the Mauryan Empire was staggering. We're talking about ChandraGupta Maurya around 300 BCE.
Right?
His standing army was estimated at 600,000 infantry, 30,000 cavalry, and 9,000 war elephants.
The logistics required just to feed 9,000 war elephants on campaign is an organizational miracle.
Seriously.
But tactically, the war elephant was the ancient equivalent of an armored tank.
I try to put myself in the boots of an opposing cavalryman, You've trained your entire life on horseback. Your horses are used to the smell of other horses, the sound of bronze clashing, and suddenly the ground literally starts vibrating.
It must have been terrifying.
Through the dust, these massive, gray, 4-ton beasts emerge, covered in armor, with archers shooting from towers on their backs. The psychological terror must have been absolute.
It was an incredible asymmetric advantage. Horses that had never seen or smelled an elephant would immediately panic, rear up, and bolt, entirely shattering an enemy's cavalry formation before the armies even clashed.
And yet, alongside that overwhelming, ground-shaking military might, ancient India also produced one of the most sophisticated pragmatic treatises on statecraft and strategy ever written, Kautilya's Arthashastra.
Yes.
This is a 2,300-year-old text. And the most fascinating part is that despite having 9,000 living tanks at his disposal, Kautilya explicitly outlines that actual combat is a failure of statecraft.
Kautilya was ruthlessly pragmatic. He understood that war is inherently unpredictable. I mean, no matter how many elephants you have, a bad commander, a sudden storm, or a disease outbreak in your camp can destroy your empire in an afternoon.
Right, there are too many variables.
Therefore, the Arthashastra outlines a 4-step framework for dealing with adversaries that prioritizes avoiding the battlefield at all costs.
Break those 4 steps down for us, because they sound remarkably like modern geopolitical strategy.
They really do. The first step is Sama, which is diplomacy, persuasion, or conciliation. You try to flatter the enemy, build alliances, or negotiate a mutually beneficial treaty.
Makes sense.
If words fail, you move to the second step. Dhamma. This is financial temptation, bribery.
Just buy them off.
Exactly. You pay them off, or you offer them economic incentives, trade routes, or land to make the problem go away. Paying off an enemy is vastly cheaper than outfitting an army to fight them.
It's the ancient version of foreign aid to secure strategic interests.
Exactly. Now, if they won't be bought, you escalate to the third step, beta. This means to sow division or exploit internal rifts.
Oh, so covert ops.
Right. You send spies to spread rumors. You secretly fund the political opposition within their kingdom. You incite their allies to turn against them. You break them from the inside out so they are too weak to fight you.
And only if all of that fails do you resort to the sword.
Only then do you deploy danda, which means punishment or physical force. Even in antiquity, the sharpest strategic minds recognized that sending young men to hack each other to pieces was the absolute last, most desperate resort.
But when that last resort is triggered, the results rewrite history. I want to look at 3 legendary battles from the ancient world that put these concepts into practice.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the ultimate underdog story, the Battle of Marathon, 490 BCE. You have roughly 10,000 Athenian hoplites defending their homeland against an invading Persian force of around 25,000.
The odds were terrible.
The Athenians are vastly outnumbered, and if they lose, Athens burns.
The Athenian commander, Miltiades, faces a geometrical nightmare here. If he keeps his phalanx at the traditional 8-rank depth, his line will be much shorter than the Persian line.
Right, the Persians will just wrap around them.
Exactly. The Persians will simply walk around his flanks and surround him. But if he thins his line out to match the Persian width, the phalanx loses that crucial crushing power, the ophthismos, and the Persians will easily break right through the middle.
So he does something incredibly counterintuitive. He intentionally weakens his own center.
It was a massive gamble.
He leaves the middle of his line dangerously thin, maybe only 4 ranks deep, but he packs his wings, the left and right sides, incredibly deep and strong.
And when the battle begins, the Persians, who have their most elite troops in their center, smash into the thin Athenian middle, and the Athenian center is pushed backward.
Looks like they're losing.
But, and this is the genius, they don't break and run. They conduct a fighting retreat, slowly giving ground, bowing backward. The Persians think they're winning, so they surge forward into that receding center.
And by pushing forward into the middle, the Persians unknowingly walk into a U-shape. They create a pocket. And those heavily reinforced Athenian wings, which had easily defeated the weaker Persian flanks, swing inward.
It's a vice grip.
The Persians are suddenly attacked from the left, the right, and the front. The panic sets in.
And you have to remember, the Persian armor was mostly layered linen and wicker shields, which were totally useless in close quarters, crushing combat against the heavy bronze weapons of the Greeks.
It turned into a slaughter.
It really did. The Persians lost roughly 6,400 men. The Athenians lost exactly 192.
A stunning tactical victory. And it culminates with the famous legend of the messenger running the 26 miles from the blood-soaked beaches of Marathon back to the city of Athens.
Right.
He bursts into the assembly, shouts, "Nika coming! We won!" and drops dead of exhaustion. It's where we get the modern marathon. But it's born from this sheer geometric brilliance on the battlefield.
It proves that tactical manipulation of the enemy's psychology and momentum can overcome overwhelming numerical superiority.
Which perfectly sets up our next battle, featuring perhaps the greatest ancient commander of them all, Alexander the Great at Gaugamela, 331 BCE.
A classic.
This is the decisive showdown for the Persian Empire. Alexander has about 47,000 troops. He is staring across a massive, flat plain at the Persian king, Darius III, who has amassed a monstrous army.
The estimates vary, but it's easily over 200,000 men.
Darius has specially prepared the ground to be perfectly flat so his scythed chariots can run down the Macedonians. Now, I have to push back on a historical detail here. Darius has a massive numerical advantage. His seasoned generals come to him and say, "Let's attack Alexander's camp tonight under the cover of darkness. We will overwhelm them."
It makes perfect, ruthless tactical sense.
Why on earth did Darius refuse?
Well, it loops directly back to what we discussed earlier about divine ego and cosmic validation. Darius famously responded to his generals, "I will not steal a victory."
I will not steal a victory. I mean, it sounds almost absurd to modern ears.
To modern ears, it's tactical malpractice. But to Darius, an ambush in the dark was the tactic of a thief, a bandit. He was the king of kings.
Ah, I see.
If he defeated Alexander in the dark, the victory would be hollow. People would say he only won through trickery. He needed to crush Alexander in the blazing daylight with the world watching to unequivocally prove his cosmic and earthly superiority. He needed a performance.
So he waits for the morning, and that decision literally costs him his empire. Because Alexander wasn't burdened by the same rigid protocols. How does Alexander dismantle an army 5 times his size?
Alexander uses the massive size of the Persian army against itself. Moving 200,000 men in coordinated formations is incredibly difficult. Alexander shifts his entire army diagonally to the right, threatening to move off the smooth terrain Darius had prepared.
Right.
Darius panics and orders his left wing to stretch out and match Alexander's movement to stop him.
And when you stretch a line of tens of thousands of men, eventually a seam is going to rip open.
Exactly. As the Persian line stretches left, a brief, fleeting gap opens up in their formation. The moment Alexander sees that crack, he instantly changes direction.
He pivots.
He forms his elite companion cavalry into a massive wedge like a spearhead and charges at full speed directly into that gap. He doesn't bother fighting the rest of the army. He aims the wedge straight at the center of the Persian line, straight at the chariot of Darius himself.
Imagine the dust, the noise, and suddenly the greatest warrior of the age is charging directly at your face. Darius looks at this unstoppable wedge bearing down on him, loses his nerve, turns his chariot, and flees the battlefield.
And when an ancient army sees their divine king running for his life, the psychological tether snaps.
The whole army breaks.
The entire massive Persian force breaks and scatters. Alexander recognized a momentary structural weakness, ignored the thousands of men on his flanks, and struck the psychological head of the snake with overwhelming, concentrated aggression. And the data point that truly underscores this brilliance: Alexander campaigned across 3 continents, through deserts and mountains for 15 years, and never lost a single battle. 0 defeats.
It's an unparalleled record. But if we are talking about unparalleled tactical genius, I want to challenge you on this next one. Because we always hear about Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE.
Of course.
It's taught in every military academy. But Hannibal had 50,000 Carthaginians against 86,000 Romans. Didn't he essentially just copy the marathon playbook? He weakened his center and wrapped around the Romans. What makes Cannae so uniquely horrific and brilliant?
You're right that the core concept, the double envelopment, is similar to Marathon. But the execution at Cannae was a masterpiece of dynamic, fluid geometry under unimaginable pressure.
How did he set it up?
Hannibal didn't just have a weak center. He deployed his army in a crescent moon shape, bulging out toward the Roman lines. He put his Gallic and Spanish infantry troops, the Romans considered inferior, in that bulging center. He placed his elite African heavy infantry hidden in columns on the far edges of the crescent and his cavalry on the wings.
So the Romans, who rely on brutal, forward-pushing momentum,
Yeah.
see this bulging center and just smash into it.
And just as Hannibal planned, the center slowly gives ground. But here is the genius. As the center bows backward, the Roman soldiers instinctively funnel inward, crowding together to push into the gap.
They're bunching up.
They are packed tighter and tighter. Meanwhile, Hannibal's heavy infantry on the edges haven't moved. As the Roman mass pushes deep into the inverted crescent, those elite African troops simply face inward. They form the sides of a box.
And then the Carthaginian cavalry, having defeated the Roman horsemen, swings around and closes the back door. The Romans are entirely boxed in.
They're completely encircled, 80,000 men trapped in a space so tight that the men in the center literally couldn't raise their arms to draw their swords.
And this is where we have to pause and confront the absolute visceral horror of ancient warfare. We aren't talking about pushing a button and dropping a bomb from 30,000 feet. In that encirclement at Cannae, 70,000 Romans were killed in a single afternoon.
It's horrifying.
Let's do the horrific math on that.
Well, if the slaughter lasted, say, 14 hours of daylight, you are looking at a mechanical kill rate of 5,000 deaths an hour.
5,000 human beings a minute. And every single one of those deaths required a Carthaginian soldier to physically drive a blade through bone, muscle, and armor.
Right.
To chop, to stab, to bludgeon, the sheer physical exhaustion of swinging a sword for 10 hours straight. The blood making the ground so slip you can't stand.
The psychological trauma.
Yes, the psychological trauma of doing that kind of intimate, eye-to-eye killing hour after hour. It's a level of apocalyptic horror that our modern minds simply cannot process.
Cannae remains the perfect tactical victory, the golden fleece of military strategy. But the human cost was a butchery on an industrial scale, executed entirely by human muscle.
Apocalyptic is the right word. And as we transition out of the ancient world, we hit a literal apocalypse for the Roman Empire. In 476 CE, Rome falls.
End of an era.
The centralized state, the massive organized legions with their standardized armor, the paved roads, the massive supply chains, it all collapses. We enter the Dark Ages, the medieval period.
Right.
And if war is a constant, how do we transition from these highly organized, state-sponsored ancient armies to the decentralized, muddy, chaotic battles of the Middle Ages?
Well, when the centralized authority and tax base of Rome vanished, the infrastructure to support standing armies vanished with it. Europe fragmented into hundreds of small, isolated fiefdoms.
Everyone fending for themselves.
Exactly. The grand geopolitical objectives of the ancient empires, like conquering the Mediterranean, were replaced by hyperlocal struggles just to secure the next valley over. But as the centuries passed in this fragmented landscape, a new, unifying framework emerged.
A new narrative.
A weapon that provided a sharper narrative and a deeper motivation than any Roman emperor ever could: religion.
Religion entirely changes the objectives of war. We're shifting from, I want to conquer your city to take your water and enslave your people, to something much deeper and arguably much darker.
Well, exactly. And the ultimate expression of this ideological shift is the Crusades.
Right.
In 1095 CE, Pope Urban II stands up at the Council of Clermont and gives a speech. He isn't calling for a war to secure trade routes or resources. He is calling for a holy war to violently reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. His rallying cry is, Dos Volt, God wills it.
God wills it.
Yeah.
Those two words sparked 200 years of relentless transcontinental warfare.
Yeah.
Think about how that changes the psychology of a soldier. If you are fighting for land, you can negotiate a border. You can compromise. But when the creator of the universe is supposedly ordering the war, compromise is a literal sin.
That is the terrifying shift. If God wills the war, then the total destruction of the infidel isn't just a military objective, it becomes a moral imperative. Mercy becomes a spiritual failure. But beneath this overarching religious canopy, the actual mechanics of how a lord raised an army to go fight these holy wars had also changed entirely, leading to the system of feudalism.
I love how the source material for this deep dive phrased it. In the Middle Ages, war became rent. Unpack the legal mechanisms of that for us.
It's an incredibly accurate way to look at it because there was no standing national army and no cash economy to pay mercenaries. The currency of the realm was land and blood.
Land and blood.
The king technically owned all the land. He would lease a massive tract of land to a duke or a baron. But the baron didn't pay rent in gold. He paid rent by signing a contract that stipulated he owed the king, say, 40 armed knights for 40 days of military service every year.
And the baron does the same thing down the chain.
Right.
He leases smaller parcels of land to the knights, and their rent is their physical military service to the baron, and the peasants farm the land to feed the knights.
Exactly. It's a pyramid scheme of violence. The ironclad law holding medieval society together was this feudal obligation. If the king called his banners, the baron had to provide the troops.
And if they didn't?
If a knight refused to show up, he didn't just break a lease. He broke a sacred religious oath of fealty. He would be stripped of his land, his honor, and potentially face excommunication. The entire society was structured around the contractual obligation to wage war on behalf of your landlord.
So Western Europe is locked in this decentralized religious feudal system, fighting over castles and theology. But meanwhile, sweeping in from the eastern steppes comes an empire with a completely different objective and a terrifyingly modern approach to warfare.
The Mongols.
We have to talk about Genghis Khan and the Mongols.
Yeah.
Because their primary objective wasn't religious conversion and it wasn't feudal rent. Their ultimate weapon was psychological terror. Now, let me push back here for a second.
Sure.
Didn't the Romans use psychological terror? They crucified 6,000 slaves along the Appian Way. What makes the Mongol use of terror so uniquely brilliant?
That's a great distinction. The Romans used terror as a punishment after a rebellion. The Mongols weaponized terror as a highly efficient, cost-saving, preventative measure.
Preventative?
Yes. Genghis Khan understood a fundamental truth of human nature. Fear is infinitely cheaper than fighting.
Makes sense.
The Mongols were a nomadic cavalry army. They couldn't afford a war of attrition where they lost thousands of men besieging a city for years. They needed cities to capitulate instantly. So they developed a brilliantly brutal binary strategy.
The choice was absolute. When a Mongol army approached your city walls, they sent an emissary with a simple offer. Surrender immediately, open your gates, pay tribute, and not a single drop of your blood will be shed.
Right. You survive.
You can keep your religion, keep your local leaders, and join the Mongol trade network. But if you resist, even for a single day, you will face total apocalyptic annihilation.
And they meant total. The illustrative detail that truly highlights the scale of this terror is the fate of the city of Nishapur in 1221.
Tell us about Nishapur.
A prominent Mongol general, who was actually Genghis Khan's son-in-law, was killed by an arrow from the city walls during a brief siege. To avenge him and to send a message that would echo across the continent, Genghis Khan ordered the entire city leveled.
They didn't just kill the garrison, they slaughtered the entire population.
Yeah.
174,000 human beings were systematically executed.
It's unimaginable.
They severed the heads and stacked them in massive pyramids outside the ruined walls. But it didn't stop with the humans. They slaughtered every single animal in the city. The horses, the livestock. They even hunted down and beheaded the stray dogs and cats in the streets.
To a modern observer, it looks like sheer senseless barbarism. But to the Mongol high command, there was a chillingly rational strategic logic behind the beheaded cats.
Wait, really? Logic to that?
Yes. If a merchant travels past the smoking ruins of Nishapur and sees a mountain of human skulls alongside the skulls of dogs and cats, word spreads along the Silk Road. The message transmitted is clear. The Mongols aren't just an invading army, they are an unstoppable force of nature that will erase your entire biological existence from the face of the earth if you defy them.
It's a viral terror campaign. And what was the practical result of that brutality?
The result was that the next dozen cities along the route surrendered the moment they saw the Mongol dust on the horizon. The psychological warfare was so effective that the Mongols conquered more territory in 25 years than the Romans did in 400, often without having to even draw a bowstring. Terror saved Mongol lives.
Unbelievable scale. Okay, so we have the psychological warfare of the East and the armored feudalism of the West. Let's look at the tactical shifts on the medieval battlefield itself. In the ancient world, infantry was king, the phalanx, and the legion.
Right.
But the medieval battlefield belonged to a new apex predator, the armored knight.
Right. Oh, definitely. By the late Middle Ages, advancements in metallurgy had transformed the wealthy noble into a practically invulnerable weapons platform.
A weapons platform.
You are looking at a man encased head to toe in 60 to 70 pounds of articulated, custom-fitted plate steel. He is riding a massive warhorse called a destrier, which itself might be draped in another 100 pounds of chainmail and steel plating.
Against standard peasant infantry with spears or crude swords, A charge of heavy knights was an unstoppable avalanche.
Mhm.
They were the medieval equivalent of tanks.
But physics always finds a way to balance the scales. And the physical counter to the armored knight arrived in the form of a 6-foot piece of carved yew wood, the English longbow.
Right.
We see this dramatic clash of armor versus physics at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415.
Set the scene for us, because this setup looks completely impossible for the English.
King Henry V of England is desperately trying to retreat his army across northern France to the safety of the port of Calais. His army is a disaster.
They're a mess.
They are starving, exhausted from weeks of marching, and decimated by an outbreak of dysentery. He has perhaps 6,000 men left, the vast majority of them lightly armored commoners wielding longbows.
And what are they facing?
Blocking his path is the pristine French royal army. They have roughly 36,000 men, fresh, well-fed, and packed with the absolute elite aristocratic knights of France, all encased in shining plate armor. By all the traditional rules of medieval warfare, the English should have been wiped off the map before lunch.
But war isn't fought on a spreadsheet. It's fought on geography. And the terrain played a massive, fatal role here.
Crucially, the battlefield was a narrow strip of land sandwiched between two dense woods, which meant the massive French army couldn't outflank the small English force. They had to attack straight ahead.
Right into the teeth of it.
But worse, the field had just been deeply plowed for winter wheat, and it had rained torrentially the night before. The ground was thick, clinging, clay-heavy mud.
The French knights, completely convinced that their heavy armor made them invincible against peasant arrows, ordered a frontal charge. But as these massive armored horses churned into the plowed field, they sank up to their knees. The unstoppable charge slowed to a miserable, floundering crawl.
And that is when Henry orders his longbowmen to open fire. The physics of the longbow are terrifying. These bows had a draw weight of over 150 pounds.
Wow.
It required a lifetime of skeletal conditioning just to pull the string back. An experienced archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows a minute. With 5,000 archers, that is a localized weather event of 60,000 arrows raining down on the French line every single minute.
And they weren't firing standard hunting arrows. They were firing bodkin, points-heavy, needle-like steel tips, specifically designed by blacksmiths to punch through plate armor. Even if a bodkin arrow didn't pierce the thickest part of a breastplate, when you have 60,000 arrows a minute falling from the sky, they find the weak points. They find the armpit joints, the eye slits in the visors, and most importantly, they find the unprotected flanks of the horses.
The horses panic. They buck, throwing their heavily armored riders into the deep, churning mud. Under the sheer 70-pound weight of their own plate steel, many knights simply couldn't stand back up.
It's like quicksand.
The mud created a vacuum suction. As more French troops pressed forward from the rear, desperate to get into the fight, they tripped over the fallen men. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of the elite nobles of France drowned in 3 inches of mud, suffocated inside their own incredibly expensive armor.
The casualty disparity is one of the most shocking in military history. Around 6,000 French nobles died that day. The English lost maybe 400 men.
A staggering upset.
A ragged band of sick, dysentery-stricken peasants with curved pieces of wood utterly decimated the aristocratic elite of a superpower. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a massive disruption of the medieval social order. It proved that a commoner with superior technology could kill a lord.
It was the beginning of the end for the knightly class. But arrows weren't the only terrifying technology of the medieval period. This era also saw the brutal refinement of siege warfare and the earliest, darkest glimpses of biological warfare.
Right. If you can't defeat a castle's walls, you throw things over them.
Yeah.
Explain the mechanics of the trebuchet. It's not just a catapult, is it?
No, a catapult uses the tension of twisted ropes. A trebuchet uses the terrifying reliability of gravity. It is a massive wooden siege engine with a long throwing arm on a pivot. On the short end of the arm is a massive wooden box filled with tons of rocks or lead. On the long end is a sling holding the projectile. When you drop the heavy counterweight, the long arm whips upward with incredible velocity, slinging the projectile forward. A large trebuchet could hurl a 300-pound stone over 300 yards, smashing castle battlements to powder.
But they didn't just throw stones. And this brings us to one of the most chilling tactical decisions in human history, the Siege of Kaffa in 1346.
Kaffa was a heavily fortified Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. A massive Mongol army was besieging it. The walls were holding. But then a mysterious, devastating plague broke out within the Mongol camp.
The Black Death.
Right, soldiers were developing black swellings, coughing blood, and dying in days. The Mongol army was melting away from the disease.
Normally, a besieging army struck by plague just breaks camp and goes home. But the Mongol commander makes a decision that changes world history.
He orders his engineers to take the infected, rotting corpses of his own dead soldiers, load them into the slings of the trebuchets, and hurl them over the city walls into Kaffa.
It is deliberate, weaponized biological warfare in the 14th century. The streets of Kaffa were suddenly littered with plague-ridden corpses. The panicked Genoese merchants, realizing the city was doomed, abandoned Kaffa. They boarded their galleys and sailed back toward the Mediterranean, toward Italy.
But they weren't alone on those ships. Deep in the cargo holds were rats, and on those rats were fleas that had fed on the infected corpses.
Oh, man.
That single tactical decision to catapult the dead over the walls of Kaffa is widely believed to be the primary spark that transported the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, into the heart of Europe. It ignited the Black Death, which ultimately wiped out roughly a third of the entire European population.
It is the ultimate butterfly effect of war. A tactical decision made outside a trading post in Crimea altered the demographic, economic, and religious future of an entire continent.
It's hard to even fathom.
It's hard to even wrap your mind around the scale of that consequence. So we've covered the armored knights suffocating in mud, the physics of the longbow, the gravity-powered trebuchets hurling plague. How does humanity transition out of the mud and the castles of the Middle Ages into the modern era of warfare?
The transition pivots on a single explosive chemical compound that shattered the feudal architecture forever: gunpowder. And the ultimate watershed moment, the turning of the historical page, is the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of the Roman Empire. It had stood for 1,000 years. Its massive triple defensive walls, the Theodosian walls, were considered completely and utterly impregnable. Armies had besieged it for centuries and failed.
But an ambitious 21-year-old Ottoman sultan named Mehmed II realized that stone walls, no matter how thick, operated on the old physics of medieval siege engines. He understood that gunpowder represented a new reality.
So what did he do?
He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build the ultimate siege weapon known as the basilica gun.
We have to describe the sheer scale of this weapon. It wasn't a cannon you just roll around on wheels.
No, it was a monstrous bronze tube, over 27 feet long. It was so massive it required a team of 60 oxen and 200 men just to drag it into position. And its ammunition wasn't a cannonball you could hold in your hands. It fired solid stone balls weighing 1,500 pounds.
1,500 pounds. It is literally like firing a small car at a wall at hundreds of miles an hour.
The logistics of firing it were a nightmare. The bronze got so hot after a single shot that it had to be continually slathered in warm oil to prevent the barrel from cracking. It took 3 hours to reload. They could only fire it maybe 7 times a day.
But when it hit.
But when that cannon roared, the earth shook for miles, and the invincible 1,000-year-old walls of Constantinople simply exploded into dust.
And with those walls falling, the entire medieval paradigm collapsed.
Yeah.
Think about what gunpowder did to society. A feudal lord maintained his power because he could hide inside a stone castle. Cannons rendered castles obsolete. They became tombs.
Right.
The armored knight maintained his elite status because his plate steel made him invincible. But a cheap lead musket ball, fired by a peasant with 2 weeks of training, punches right through a knight's armor.
Gunpowder democratized killing. War was no longer the exclusive, highly trained domain of aristocratic warrior elites who trained from birth. You could conscript thousands of farmers, hand them muskets, drill them to fire in unison, and wipe out an entire generation of nobility.
A complete societal shift.
Absolutely. Mass conscript armies replaced specialized warriors, power centralized away from local barons to national kings who had the massive tax revenue required to cast bronze cannons and buy tons of saltpeter.
And that centralization of power, combined with mass armies, leads us directly into the massive sweeping horror of the modern era. The rise of industrial and total war. History often points to the American Civil War as the first truly modern war.
Yes.
Let's dig into the mechanisms of why that is. Why was the Civil War fundamentally different from the Napoleonic Wars just 50 years prior?
It was different because the machinery of the Industrial Revolution had finally been integrated into the logistics of death. The Civil War saw the widespread military application of the steam railway.
Right, the trains.
In the past, an army could only march maybe 10 to 15 miles a day. They arrived at the battlefield exhausted. With trains, generals could move tens of thousands of troops and thousands of tons of heavy artillery and rations hundreds of miles in a matter of days. You could reinforce a collapsing front line from across the country.
And communication was instant. The telegraph entirely changed command and control. Before the telegraph, a president or a king sent a messenger on horseback and waited 2 weeks to find out if they won the battle.
It was a huge delay.
During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln spent hours in the War Department telegraph room, receiving real-time updates from the battlefield and sending direct, immediate orders to his generals. The political leader was suddenly micromanaging the front line.
But the most terrifying industrial upgrade was the weaponry itself, specifically the widespread use of rifling and the minie-ball. In previous eras, muskets were smoothbore, the bullet rattled down the barrel and flew out inaccurately. You were lucky to hit a barn at 50 yards.
Right.
But a rifled barrel has spiral grooves cut into the inside. The minie-ball was a conical lead bullet with a hollow base. When the gunpowder exploded, the hot gas expanded the base of the bullet, gripping the grooves. The bullet spun like a tightly thrown football.
Which meant it was accurate and deadly at distances of up to 500 yards. And yet the generals on both sides were still operating on outdated tactical manuals. They were still marching men in neat, shoulder-to-shoulder formations across open fields like they were fighting in the 1700s.
The tactics hadn't caught up to the technology. If you march shoulder to shoulder against an enemy who can accurately shoot you from a quarter mile away and who can reload their repeating rifles 3 times faster than before,
It's a bloodbath.
you are marching into an industrial buzzsaw. The human body simply cannot withstand that volume of lead. That tactical, lag-old strategies meeting new technology is exactly why the American Civil War resulted in 620,000 dead.
It was a terrifying preview of what industrialization could do to flesh and bone. But European military observers largely ignored those lessons. They thought the Americans were just undisciplined. Which brings us to the ultimate hubristic meat grinder of World War I.
The hubris of the European powers in 1914 is staggering. Every nation marched off to war convinced it would be a quick, glorious clash of empires. "We'll be home by Christmas," was the universal belief.
They really thought that.
They envisioned sweeping cavalry charges and decisive maneuvers. Instead, the lethal geometry of the machine gun and rapid-fire artillery forced millions of men to dig into the earth just to survive. They ended up with a continuous line of muddy, rat-infested trenches stretching 400 miles from the Swiss border to the North Sea.
It became an industrialized siege. And the Battle of the Somme in 1916 is the purest, darkest distillation of this strategic bankruptcy. Let's walk through the mechanics of the Somme. The British High Command, still clinging to the old paradigm that artillery wins battles, decided to simply vaporize the German lines before sending the infantry across.
The British gathered massive batteries of heavy artillery and fired millions of shells at the German trenches for 7 consecutive days and nights.
7 days.
The noise was so loud it could be heard across the English Channel in London. The British commanders confidently told their young, inexperienced soldiers, "The barbed wire is cut, the bunkers are destroyed, you won't even need your rifles, you can just walk across no man's land and occupy their trenches."
But they completely misunderstood the defensive engineering of the German army. The Germans hadn't just dug shallow ditches, they had dug deep into the chalky soil, building reinforced concrete bunkers 30-40 feet underground. They simply rode out the bombardment in the dark. So when the artillery barrage finally lifted and the whistles blew,
the German machine gunners, operating water-cooled Vickers and Maxim guns capable of firing 500 rounds a minute, hauled their weapons up the stairs from their deep dugouts, set them up on the parapets, and looked out over the shattered landscape.
and what they saw was tens of thousands of British boys weighed down by 60 pounds of gear, literally walking slowly across the cratered mud because they had been ordered not to run to keep their formations neat.
The machine gunners didn't even have to aim. They simply traversed their guns back and forth across the advancing lines, like a gardener hosing down a lawn.
The mathematical reality of that day is hard to vocalize. On the very first day of the Battle of the Somme, between sunrise and sunset, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties. 19,240 of those men were killed outright.
Unbelievable.
Nearly 20,000 human lives extinguished in a single afternoon for territorial gains that were measured in mere yards.
It was the absolute failure of 19th century military strategy crashing into 20th century industrial technology. And when the machine guns and the artillery failed to break the trench stalemate, human ingenuity provided a new elemental terror: poison gas.
We see the first major use of this at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. The German army brought thousands of metal cylinders to the front line, waited for the wind to blow toward the enemy, and opened the valves.
They've released tons of chlorine gas. The soldiers in the Allied trenches, primarily Canadian and French colonial troops, saw this eerie, heavy, yellow-green cloud rolling slowly toward them across the ground.
They had no idea what it was.
Many mistook it for a strange weather phenomenon, a thick fog.
But the chemistry of chlorine gas is horrifying. When that gas rolled into the trenches, it reacted with the moisture in the soldiers' lungs and eyes to form hydrochloric acid. It literally dissolved lung tissue from the inside out. The men drowned in their own bodily fluids. 5,000 soldiers died in agony simply from breathing the air. War had stopped being an assault on the enemy's body with metal. It had become an assault on the very elements of life itself.
And that industrialization of slaughter, the mobilizing of science and factories to create mass death, only accelerated into World War II. We transitioned fully from industrial war to total war.
Total war. That's a phrase we throw around. But explain the fundamental shift in logic. What did total war mean for the average person living in a city?
Total war meant that the boundary between the uniformed soldier on the battlefield and the civilian on the home front was entirely erased. In a total war, the entire economic output of a nation, the steel mills, the car factories, the farms, the rail yards, and the civilian populace working in them, is mobilized for the war machine. Therefore, the logic dictates that if an enemy factory is building the tanks that are killing your soldiers, then destroying that factory is a legitimate military objective. And if destroying that factory means killing the thousands of civilian men and women who work there and bombing the neighborhoods where they sleep, that is also considered a legitimate military necessity.
We see the terrifying efficiency of this integration of machines and men with the German blitzkrieg, lightning war. It wasn't just fast, it was completely mechanized coordination. German panzer tanks breaking the lines, communicating via two-way radios with Stuka dive bombers overhead to eliminate strong points, bypassing cities and collapsing entire countries in weeks.
They conquered Poland in 27 days.
Wow.
The Polish army, parts of which were still relying on horse cavalry charges, simply couldn't comprehend the speed and three-dimensional violence of mechanized radio-coordinated warfare.
But the absolute nadir of this era, the bloodiest, most unyielding clash in human history, wasn't a sweeping tank maneuver. It was the Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 and 43. Two totalitarian regimes, Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, throwing millions of men into an urban meat grinder.
Over 2 million casualties in 6 months. The scale is unfathomable. It became known as the Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Because the city was bombed to absolute rubble, tanks were useless.
Right, it was all close quarters.
It devolved into men fighting room to room, floor to floor, throwing grenades down elevator shafts. The Soviets would hold the kitchen of an apartment building while the Germans held the living room.
And the environmental hubris is astounding. They were fighting in minus 40-degree weather, and thousands of German soldiers froze to death because they were still wearing their summer uniforms.
Yeah.
Hitler had been so arrogantly convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse in a few months that he hadn't bothered to prepare winter logistics.
It was a clash of absolute psychotic wills. The German Sixth Army was slowly pulverized and surrounded. Field Marshal Paulus eventually defied Hitler's orders and surrendered the surviving 91,000 starving, frostbitten men of his command. He had started the campaign with an army of 300,000. Stalingrad proved that total war demanded total, absolute sacrifice of human life.
And the culmination of all this industrial science, all this mass mobilization, and all this total war logic brings us to a specific morning. August 6th, 1945, 8:15 a.m.
Hiroshima.
The physical mechanism of what happened that morning is chilling to describe. A single American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay. A single uranium-235 gun-type fission bomb, codenamed Little Boy. It drops from the bomb bay and falls through the sky for exactly 43 seconds.
It's eerie to think about that silence.
And then, at 1,900 feet above a sprawling city of 340,000 people, the radar altimeter triggers the detonator. A conventional explosive fires a uranium projectile into a uranium target. It initiates a runaway nuclear chain reaction.
In a fraction of a millisecond, a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns illuminates the city. The temperature at the hypocenter reaches millions of degrees, hotter than the surface of the sun.
Instant vaporization.
A 1.5-kilometer radius of a modern city built of concrete, wood, and flesh is simply vaporized instantly. The pressure wave flattens buildings for miles, followed by a firestorm that sucks the oxygen out of the air.
70,000 people dead in a single second. Tens of thousands more dying of radiation burns in the weeks to follow. 90% of the city ceased to exist.
J. Robert Oppenheimer, the theoretical physicist who directed the Manhattan Project, famously recalled a line from Hindu scripture upon seeing the first successful tests of the weapon. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And he was right. This wasn't just a bitter explosion. It was a fundamental philosophical break in the history of human civilization.
Right, because for 5,000 years, the basic logic of warfare was build a bigger weapon or a larger army to defeat your enemy and take their stuff. But with the splitting of the atom, mankind finally hit the ceiling of warfare.
There was nowhere higher to go.
Exactly. The weapon became so overwhelmingly powerful that using it against a peer adversary guarantees that they will fire theirs back. The concept of mutual assured destruction, going to war to protect your country, now guaranteed the complete vaporization of your country. Total war between superpowers became theoretically suicidal. It became unthinkable.
If the act of going to war guarantees your own destruction, then the political utility of a massive state-on-state total war vanishes. The atomic age forced a terrifying frozen stalemate upon the major powers.
Which brings us to an incredible, glaring paradox. If nuclear war is unthinkable, how do we fight today? Because looking at the news, we clearly haven't stopped fighting. Those 268 years of global peace haven't magically increased. We didn't stop waging war, we just changed the arena. We bridged the gap from world-ending atomic bombs to hyper-precise, localized technological warfare.
The defining characteristic of 21st century warfare is the total physical separation of the warrior from the battlefield. For the first time in human history, the person pulling the trigger is entirely immune to the physical consequences of the weapon.
That's a profound shift.
Think about modern drone warfare. You have a pilot sitting in a windowless, air-conditioned trailer on a military base in Nevada. They are staring at a heads-up display. They use a joystick to guide an MQ-9 Reaper drone, and they push a button to drop a Hellfire missile on a moving truck 7,000 miles away in a village in Yemen or Pakistan.
They watch the truck explode in high definition.
Yeah.
And then 2 hours later, their shift ends. They get in their Honda Civic, dry out of the base, pick up milk at the grocery store, and have dinner with their kids in American suburbia.
The psychological dissonance of that reality is profound.
Yeah.
The boundary between the front line and the home front hasn't just blurred, it's been entirely erased. You are simultaneously operating in a lethal combat zone and living a domestic civilian life.
And we've taken that separation of warrior and battlefield even further with cyber warfare, which entirely removes kinetic explosives from the equation. The defining example is the Stuxnet virus in 2010.
Oh, that's a wild story.
The U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies wanted to cripple the Iranian nuclear program, specifically the Natanz enrichment facility. But sending F-16 bombers to drop bunker busters would trigger a massive, bloody regional war.
So instead of sending bombers, they sent lines of computer code. They developed a maliciously brilliant zero-day computer virus. They somehow managed to get it onto the closed, air-gapped computer network of the Iranian facility.
An air-gapped network, which means it wasn't even connected to the internet.
Exactly. And the virus was incredibly specific. It didn't shut down the power grid or erase files. It specifically targeted the programmable logic controllers, the PLCs that regulated the physical spinning of the nuclear centrifuges.
The code instructed the centrifuges to spin wildly out of control, far beyond their physical tolerances, literally tearing themselves apart. But simultaneously, the virus fed false, pre-recorded data to the Iranian engineers' computer screens in the control room, making it look like everything was operating smoothly.
The engineers spent months pulling their hair out, trying to figure out why their incredibly expensive equipment was constantly failing. It was a massive geopolitical victory. They degraded a rival nation's strategic capability without a single physical bullet being fired, without a single soldier crossing a border, without a single drop of blood. It represents a totally new, invisible domain of human conflict.
But despite all this incredible science fiction technology, stealth bombers, autonomous drones, cyber weapons that can dismantle power grids, we have to confront a glaring paradox. Let's call it the Afghanistan paradox. Look at the raw data of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. The United States spent 20 years and roughly $2.3 trillion.
Unimaginable amounts of money.
They deployed the most sophisticated military machine in the history of the universe. They had absolute air supremacy, satellite surveillance, night vision, and limitless logistics.
And yet, after 20 years, when the U.S. military withdrew in August 2021, the Taliban and insurgency, armed mostly with light weapons, pickup trucks, and a deep knowledge of the local terrain, swept across the country and retook the capital city of Kabul in just 11 days.
20 years of unmatched modern military might resulted in essentially zero permanent geopolitical change.
It is a stark, humbling reminder that technology can win firefights and drones can eliminate targets. But asymmetric warfare is a different beast entirely. You cannot permanently occupy a village square with an F-22 Raptor. Technology cannot fundamentally alter the political, cultural, or social reality on the ground if the underlying political strategy is flawed or disconnected from the people living there.
It's a sobering reality check on the limits of our high-tech hubris. But there is an even darker macro trend that emerges when you look at the entire 5,000-year evolution we've been tracking. And it concerns the grim mathematics of who actually pays the price in these wars. Unpack that horrific trend for us.
It is perhaps the most tragic irony of military evolution. In ancient times, as we discussed, civilians were often the prize. They were captured and enslaved as a valuable economic resource. In the Middle Ages, civilians were collateral damage when their cities were besieged or when passing armies foraged their crops. But in modern mechanized war, civilians have overwhelmingly become the primary victims.
Think about the progression of the numbers. In World War I, despite the sheer unprecedented horror of the trenches and the poison gas, the casualties were roughly 90% military and 10% civilian. Most of the dying happened on defined, muddy battlefields. By World War II, with the advent of strategic carpet bombing of cities, firebombing, and total war logistics, that ratio shifted drastically to about 50% military, 50% civilian. And today,
In modern conflicts, whether in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, or elsewhere, upwards of 90% of the casualties are civilians. The bitter, agonizing irony is that as our weapons became exponentially more precise, smart bombs, laser-guided missiles, GPS targeting, the percentage of civilian deaths skyrocketed.
how is that logically possible? If the bombs are smarter, shouldn't they only hit the bad guys?
Well, because of the urbanization of conflict, we don't fight in open fields anymore. Guerrilla forces and modern armies alike operate within densely populated cities. The precision of a laser-guided missile doesn't matter if the target is an apartment building in a crowded neighborhood.
Right.
Furthermore, modern war targets the infrastructure of a society. When you bomb a power grid or a water treatment plant to cripple an enemy's command centers, the hospitals lose power, the incubators fail, the water supply gets contaminated, and thousands of civilians die of disease and exposure long after the bombing stops.
The infrastructure of modern life is so fragile that destroying it is effectively a mass casualty event for the civilian population. That is an incredibly heavy truth to sit with. Which brings us to a crucial pivot in our timeline, the aftermath. Because history shows us that how human beings handle the end of a war is just as important as how they fight it.
Absolutely.
The peace settlement you construct almost entirely dictates whether your children will have to fight another war 20 years later.
Let's look at how peace settlements have evolved. The ancient approach was often entirely binary. Total destruction or complete assimilation. We mentioned Rome. When Rome finally defeated Carthage in the Third Punic War in 146 BCE, they didn't just sign a treaty. They burned the city to the ground, enslaved the survivors, and legend says they salted the earth so no crops would ever grow there again.
Salting the earth.
It's the ultimate punitive peace. Annihilation. The problem is erased. Conversely, Alexander the Great favored assimilation. When he conquered Persia, he ordered his generals to marry Persian noblewomen. He adopted Persian court dress. He tried to blend the leadership of the conquered into his own empire to create stability.
And we do see early sophisticated attempts at diplomacy. The very first recorded, formalized peace treaty in human history was signed in 1275 BCE between the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II and the Hittite king.
It's a fascinating document.
They fought to a bloody standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, realized neither side could win without destroying themselves, and sat down to negotiate. They engraved the treaty on silver tablets, establishing borders and mutually agreeing to extradite political refugees. It's so foundational that a replica of that 3,300-year-old treaty hangs in the United Nations headquarters today.
Moving forward to the medieval period, Peace was often highly transactional. It was a business deal. We see a massive ransom culture among the nobility. When King Richard the Lionheart of England was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor while returning from the Crusades, he wasn't executed or put in a dungeon to rot.
No, they wanted to get paid.
He was held hostage for a literal king's ransom, 150,000 marks, which was equivalent to an entire year's worth of England's national income. The whole country was heavily taxed just to buy back their king. War was an aristocratic extortion racket. But we also see strange periods of enforced stability through overwhelming force, like the Pax Mongolica.
All right, the Mongol piece. The Mongols destroyed everything in their path, but once they definitively conquered you and broke your resistance, they established an incredibly safe, unified transcontinental trade zone from China to Eastern Europe. The sheer terror of Mongol retribution meant crime was non-existent. It allowed merchants like Marco Polo to travel safely across the Silk Road. And ironically, it was that exact peace and open trade route that allowed the secret recipe for gunpowder to travel from Chinese alchemists to European engineers, changing Western warfare forever.
But the truly vital lessons about how to end a war come from the modern era. And they come from contrasting the disastrous end of World War I with the strategic brilliance of the end of World War II. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 is the ultimate textbook example of how not to make peace.
The victorious Allied powers, primarily France and Britain, were bleeding and exhausted, and they wanted revenge. They decided to entirely humiliate Germany. They imposed mathematically impossible financial reparations, stripped Germany of its industrial territory, severely limited its military, and forced them to sign a war guilt clause, taking complete moral responsibility for the entire catastrophe.
It was crushing.
Germany actually didn't finish paying off the interest on those WWI reparations until the year 2010.
It was a peace built entirely on vindictive punishment. The brilliant British economist John Maynard Keynes was actually at the Versailles Conference, and he saw the math. He walked out in sheer disgust. He wrote a book warning the world, essentially saying, if you purposefully crush the German economy, you will destabilize the entire center of Europe. This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years.
And his prediction was terrifyingly exact. The economic desperation, the hyperinflation where Germans were burning wheelbarrows of cash just to stay warm, and the deep national humiliation caused directly by Versailles created the perfect fertile ground for demagogues. It directly led to the rise of fascism, Adolf Hitler, and the outbreak of World War II, exactly 2 decades later. Punitive peace breeds the next war.
But humanity, miraculously, actually learned a lesson from that failure. After the even greater devastation of World War II, the United States, as the predominant intact global power, executed what might be the greatest strategic masterstroke of the 20th century, the Marshall Plan.
Instead of repeating Versailles and punishing their defeated, ruined enemies, the United States decided to rebuild them. The U.S. pumped $13 billion, which is equivalent to roughly $150 billion today, into actively rebuilding the shattered infrastructure, factories, and economies of Western Europe, including West Germany, and they engaged in a massive rebuilding effort in Japan.
It was the strategic genius of generosity. It wasn't just charity. It was highly pragmatic self-interest. The U.S. understood that a prosperous, democratic Germany and Japan would be the strongest bulwarks against the spread of Soviet communism, and they would become massive consumers of American exports. You defeat your enemy, and then you pay to rebuild their society.
And what is the result of that investment? Today, Germany and Japan are the 4th and 3rd largest economies in the world, and 2 of America's strongest, most stable democratic allies. Generosity and economic integration succeeded where vindictive punishment had failed catastrophically.
And alongside that massive economic rebuilding project came a profound legal revolution, the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 46.
This is a massive shift. For the first time in human history, the leaders who started a war of aggression and orchestrated genocide weren't just exiled to a comfortable island, and they weren't just summarily executed in a ditch.
They were put on trial.
They were put in a meticulously documented courtroom, given defense lawyers, and held personally, legally accountable for crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. It established the precedent that I was just following orders is not a legal defense for mass murder. It birthed the concept of international human rights law as we know it today, laying the groundwork for the modern International Criminal Court.
It was a fundamental attempt to change the incentive structure of global power, to clearly broadcast to the future. If you launch an aggressive war, if you order the systematic massacre of civilians, you cannot hide behind your uniform, your medals, or your sovereign immunity. You will be pulled from your office and you will face justice.
So after this exhaustive 5,000-year journey, from fighting over muddy water rights in Mesopotamia with bronze spears to unleashing cyber viruses in Iranian nuclear facilities, we need to synthesize this massive timeline. What are the eternal truths that emerge from the data? Because despite all the technological leaps, certain fundamental philosophical truth about human conflict remains stubbornly, tragically intact.
The first truth that emerges clearly from the historical record is perhaps the most frustrating for military planners. War almost never solves the root political issue. A military victory without a comprehensive, equitable political solution is just hitting the pause button on the violence.
That's a great way to put it.
You can draw a straight causal line through history. The unresolved treaties of the Napoleonic Wars set up the complex, paranoid alliance structures that triggered World War I. The punitive, crushing peace of World War I directly caused World War II. And the way World War II ended, with the map of Europe divided by occupying armies, locked us into a 50-year Cold War. Brute force can suppress a problem. It can eliminate an immediate threat, but it rarely cures the underlying disease.
The second truth is deeply cynical, but historically undeniable. The decision makers don't die. In the ancient world, there was a physical accountability to leadership. Kings like Alexander the Great or Richard the Lionheart literally led the charge from the front lines.
Yay.
Alexander was wounded by swords and arrows multiple times in combat. If he made a bad tactical call, he physically bled for it. His life was on the line alongside his soldiers.
Today, the disconnect is absolute and complete. The political leaders who declare war and the generals who plan it sit securely in fortified, climate-controlled bunkers or wood-paneled offices in Washington, Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran. They suffer zero physical risk. The people who actually bleed and die are 19-year-old soldiers who barely understand the geopolitical chess game they are pawns in, and as we've seen, millions of innocent civilians trapped in the crossfire. The ultimate cost of war is almost always paid by those who had absolutely no voice in starting it.
But amid all that darkness, all the 1,500-pound cannons and vaporized cities, there is a third truth, and it's a truth about the staggering, heroic power of human restraint. Let me tell you a story from October 27, 1962.
The Cuban Missile Crisis.
It is the absolute height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world is teetering on a nice edge. A Soviet submarine, the B-59, is hiding deep in the Atlantic Ocean near Cuba. American naval destroyers have detected it, and they are dropping practice depth charges, essentially small explosives, trying to force the submarine to surface and identify itself.
But the submarine has been too deep for too long. They have lost all radio contact with Moscow. The air conditioning has failed. It is sweltering inside, over 100 degrees. The men are suffocating on rising carbon dioxide levels, exhausted and terrified. And every few minutes, massive explosions are rocking the hull. The captain of the submarine, cut off from the world and under attack, firmly believes that World War III has already started on the surface.
And the B-59 isn't just a standard submarine. It is carrying a 10-kiloton nuclear-tipped torpedo. The captain, believing his nation is already at war and his ship is about to be destroyed, makes the decision. He gives the order to arm the nuclear torpedo and launch it at the American aircraft carrier above them. Launching that torpedo would instantly kill thousands of American sailors.
Well, it's sort of the end of the world.
It would guarantee a retaliatory American nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, which would trigger a Soviet strike on America. It would literally be the end of human civilization. Now, Soviet naval protocol required 3 senior officers aboard the sub to agree to a nuclear launch. The captain says yes. The political officer says yes. They turn to the third man, the second in command, a man named Vasily Arkhipov.
2 men have just voted to initiate the apocalypse. The pressure on Arkhipov must have been completely unimaginable. The heat, the panic, the screaming captain, the explosions echoing through the water. But Arkhipov looked at the situation, assessed the data, and said no.
He just said no. He argued with the captain, he pushed back, he refused to turn his key, he convinced the captain to surface the submarine and await orders from Moscow. That single no from one exhausted man in a tin can at the bottom of the ocean saved the world.
It is the ultimate profound proof that the best, most important wars in human history are the ones that remain unfought. Think of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the intense military standoffs between nuclear-armed India and Pakistan in 2002, the tense, 70-year ceasefire on the Korean Peninsula. Diplomacy, communication, and sheer stubborn human restraint have saved the world far more times than any weapon ever has.
So think about what that means for you and the headlines you read every day. We've traced warfare from bronze spears pushing in the mud to longbows to atomic bombs to operators flying drones from a hemisphere away. The technology changes at a blinding, exponential pace. But the human drivers of conflict, fear of the other, economic greed, massive ego, the tribal need to prove that we cannot be pushed around, those psychological drivers remain exactly the same as they were 5,000 years ago in Sumeria.
And that leads us to a precipice. We are currently standing right on the edge of the next great revolution in human conflict. AI-driven combat. Fully autonomous weapons systems, drone swarms powered by algorithms that can identify, select, and engage human targets at machine speed entirely without human intervention.
So the question for you to mull over, the thought we want to leave you with is this. What happens to humanity when the decision to kill and the execution of that killing is removed from human hands entirely? If our human flaws, our fear, our ego, our panic under pressure are the historical root causes of war, is removing human emotion from the trigger the ultimate logical solution to ending conflict? Or without a human being like Vasily Arkhipov there to feel empathy, to doubt the instruments, and to bravely say no, is handing the weapons over to the cold logic of an algorithm the final, irreversible disaster?
It is the defining question of our era, and history suggests we don't have much time to figure out the answer.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the evolution of conflict. Keep questioning the narratives, keep digging into the history beneath the headlines, and keep looking closely at the world around you. Until next time.